In our first episode, we saw how the war in Europe begins. Now we're going to look at Japan's growing empire, finally bringing America into the war. Welcome back. Teaching from home, at least for the first part of this video. In the kitchen, got a frozen pizza in the oven. I'm going to give you some background on Japan today, leading up all the way to Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war by the American government. We're going to start in 1868. Japan has been just a conglomerate of feudal local communities with local or island loyalties. But in 1868, Japan will nationalize, become one country with a national education program, mass conscription into the Japanese national military, mass industrialization experienced at the same time by the U.S. during the Gilded Age. And with this, the idea of Japan as a nation begins to grip the people and came with a desire for more land and more power. That's where we jump into our story. Japan's new leaders in 1871 pushed for sound foreign policy and negotiated island borders with Russia, China, and Korea. But within 10 years, feuds with Taiwan and China resulted in Japan winning control of more southern islands. By 1895, Japan had made great gains in the Sino-Japanese War by winning the entire Korean peninsula and the island of Taiwan. And by 1904, a war with Russia resulted in more Japanese holdings within China. After joining World War I in 1914, the Japanese used their geographic advantage to seize German possessions throughout the Pacific. They also gained access to all markets formerly controlled by Britain, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, who were all busy fighting the Germans in Europe. With no damage on their homeland in World War I, this gave them a decided economic advantage. After World War I, Japan became more democratic. A two-party system developed, liberals and conservatives, and controlled foreign policy and the military. Japan was doing well economically, with a lot of industrial development after World War I, and had grown wealthy through trade. Oh, hey, I'm back in the classroom. Anyway, Japan's economy being dependent on manufacturing and trade, the coming global depression of the 1930s will have a devastating impact. Many countries put tariffs on Japanese goods, including the United States. Sales declined, layoffs began, the people became angry with this new two-party system as the two parties just bickered and offered no solutions. So while America's two-party system survived the Depression, Japan's crumbled. Japanese nationalists called for the young emperor-in-waiting Hirohito to take charge, and business and political leaders were being assassinated by domestic terrorists. Soon, the military took action, without the elected government's permission, to seize leadership and try to get beyond this depression. Similar to the German policy of Lebensraum that we talked about in the last video, Japan recognized that the island nation had a lack of resources like oil and rubber, and a lack of farmland to feed its rising population. And if it was going to climb out of the Depression, the military would have to act. Like many nations before them, Japan tried to solve these economic problems through imperialism and expansion. And in 1931, the Japanese military, without the permission of their government, invaded mainland China. By 1932, they had taken charge of a large piece of Manchuria, set up their own government run by Japanese military officials, all to control the region's rich farming and mining. Despite never authorizing the taking of Manchuria, the Japanese government moved in 1 million Japanese farmers and entrepreneurs and named the area Province of Japan. Britain had been a longtime ally to Japan since the two entered into a treaty in 1913. Britain told Japan, get out of Manchuria. The United States, a longtime trade partner for Japan, told them the same. And when the League of Nations began to discuss taking actions against Japan, Japan quit the League of Nations in 1933. The military had greater influence over the decisions of the Japanese government than either political party did. Naval officers assassinated the prime minister in the 1930s when he tried to rein them in and limit the decision-making powers of military officers. And while the military never took over the government had no control over it, and the Army and Navy had the support of Japan's working and poor class, who saw promise in foreign expansion. By 1937, the 1.7 million man Japanese army was increasing holdings in China and killing as many as 300,000 Chinese civilians as they ran over the capital city of Nankin that had been abandoned by the Chinese army. The level of brutality reported by foreigners in the city, who were off limits according to Japanese officers, is devastating. The Japanese army, which increased to 6 million soldiers by 1945, will demonstrate immense brutality throughout World War II and engage in atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. In reaction to the aggression against China, both the Soviet Union and Great Britain, who both had treaties with Japan, sent arms, military advisors, warplanes, and other supplies to China. This did nothing to slow down Japan as they continued their expansion in the Pacific, with European countries at war with the Nazis. Their colonies in Asia were fair game for the Japanese. As they antagonized the Allies, Japan joined the tripartite agreement with Germany and Italy. Japan now had the backing of Hitler and Mussolini to continue their expansion throughout the Pacific, now confronting American possessions such as Guam and Wake Island. So what does all this Japanese aggression have to do with the United States? For the most part, the U.S. ignored it. Dealing with the problems of the Depression through the 30s and early 40s, the U.S. wasn't looking for any foreign conflicts. So, in order to protect and isolate the U.S., not just physically, where the Atlantic and the Pacific provided a buffer from both of these exploding war zones, but the U.S. Congress is going to pass the Neutrality Acts and attempt to even economically create a buffer for the United States from ending up being pulled into what looked like was going to become World War II. The first Neutrality Act in 1935 prohibited the sale or shipment of any war materials to any nation at war. FDR hated this because it didn't distinguish between good guys and bad guys. The second banned the American government from giving loans to any nation at war. The third finally loosened things up a little bit and allowed trade of non-military goods such as food to nations at war, but strictly on a cash and carry basis. With this third Neutrality Act, let's talk about cash and carry. Carry just meant nations at war can buy food and non-war products from the U.S., but they have to come and get it. U.S. ships will not be traveling to any war zones. The cash part was an extension of the second Neutrality Act, which just said, you're not going to get a line of credit. America isn't giving loans. You have to come get the stuff, and you got to pay cash directly up front. After the fall of France in 1940, some Americans called for the U.S. to start giving aid to Britain and get rid of the Neutrality Acts. The American First Committee fought this idea. Charles Lindbergh spoke for the committee and said America's concern should be herself, not Britain. But FDR felt that it was the responsibility of the United States to help Britain. They had held off the Nazis so far, but they're going to need our help. Lindbergh and other isolationists fumed in 1940 when FDR traded 50 retired destroyer ships to the British in exchange for the rights to build a U.S. naval base in Bermuda. Lindbergh and others opposed this deal vocally, and Roosevelt, running for an unprecedented third term as president, promised the American people, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. FDR won a third term of the presidency with ease. So after he wins this third term to his presidency, FDR will meet with Churchill. Churchill's going to inform FDR that Britain is going broke. Cash and carry isn't even an option. So FDR asked Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act of 1941 to assist the British. It will authorize the president to give aid, military or financial, to any nation whose defense he believes is vital to American security. And immediately, the U.S. is going to send tons of aid to Britain. Soon after, sending aid to the Soviet Union. Through the Lend-Lease Act, FDR will loan $49 billion to allies at war. While assisting the allies, FDR is going to attempt to damage Japan economically by ending certain resources being sent to them, including oil, steel, and iron, and freezing financial assets held in U.S. banks. Meanwhile, a military leader has risen to one of the highest positions in Japan's republic and is going to authorize an attack on the United States of America. This attack will take place at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, a U.S. naval base. The Japanese hoped to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before the U.S. even jumped into the war, and perhaps expand through the Pacific before the U.S. could rebuild their fleet. What follows is a timeline of the events at Pearl Harbor. Early in the morning of December 7th, 1941, submarine periscopes were spotted in the Pacific Ocean outside of Pearl Harbor. U.S. ships fired at the submarine and believed they hit it, but could find no trace of the damage done. In fact, the sub wasn't found until 2002. Around the same time, 50 unidentified aircraft appeared on Pearl Harbor radar. Superiors told the radar officials to not worry about it, as they were aware of a large group of Air Force B-17s approaching from San Diego on a secure mission. They dismissed the radar alert. At 7:50 a.m., 183 Japanese planes from an aircraft carrier 180 miles from Hawaii entered Pearl Harbor U.S. Naval Base. The ships were docked in the same positions that they had been for several years. Airplanes on the base were on low alert, with planes lined up outside, exposed wing to wing, 188 of them destroyed. Torpedo droppers led the way as the Japanese pilots specifically targeted battleships, airfields, and aircraft carriers. Lucky for the U.S., all 3 aircraft carriers were at sea. By 8:10, all 9 U.S. battleships at the naval base had taken damage, with both the USS Arizona and Utah put permanently out of commission. Around 9 a.m., a second wave of Japanese airplanes arrived at Pearl Harbor to target the remaining ships. By 10 a.m., the damage is done and the attack is over. Word will soon reach FDR and U.S. government officials in Washington, D.C. The 2-hour attack killed over 2,000 Americans. The next day, the president delivered this speech. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war of an armed attack. It'll be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces, and I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. He continues to point out that hostilities exist, and finally asks Congress for a declaration of war due to this attack by Japan on December 7th, 1941. Congress and the U.S. people are overwhelmingly going to support FDR's request for a declaration of war. And within 3 days of that declaration, Germany and Italy will return the favor by declaring war on the United States. Soon after, Axis power allies Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Croatia will also declare war on the US. So look for a third World War II video to be posted soon. Leave any feedback or questions about this video on our Schoology page. Thanks.